Alright guys, and welcome to another video. Today we're going to be discussing, was Cataclysm really the death of World of Warcraft? Now, I do admit that that is a very dramatic and clickbaity title, but let's be honest, if a teacher told you can get a better grade on your essay by having a better title, you would do it in a heartbeat. And the exact same story goes for YouTube titles. Although most people, to be fair, do seem to say that the game went downhill after Cataclysm, or the game died for them, or that is when they stopped playing. And within the classic community, many, if not, well, I definitely think that most people just have zero interest in Blizzard releasing classic Cataclysm. For me personally, I wholeheartedly disagree, and I'm going to spend, most of this video kind of explaining why. Before we jump into that, guys, please throw me a quick sub if you want to, stay tuned for more videos. And if you're looking for a really good leveling guide while also supporting the channel, you may want to check out the leveling guide Rested XP. You will find links for all of that in the description below. So let's get into the meat and potatoes. I don't think Cataclysm was as bad as many people do make out, although I have to admit that the last patch of the second half of Cataclysm was definitely put World of Warcraft on a downward slope. Okay, and I think the overbearing hate of the second half of Cataclysm kind of totally washes away the first half of Cataclysm, which was very strong. Right, if you look back at sub numbers, back when they were public, for a small period of Cataclysm at the beginning, the sub numbers were actually the same as their peak in Wrath of the Lich King, and for the majority of the expansion, it was over 10 million, which is still a huge amount of players. Particularly when you think about how Warlords of Draenor essentially had half that many players. There was a big drop towards the end of Cataclysm. I think that was because the game started to get much worse as time went on, but I also think it's mainly due to the fact of the Mr. Pandaria announcement, which many people, including myself, thought was a really bad April Fool's joke, especially as the announcement was actually on April the 1st. Right? And to be honest, I still think Mr. Pandaria is a little bit of a joke. I mean, if you think about it, it's essentially a Kung Fu Panda expansion. And the sub numbers, when you look at them, clearly show that many people also thought Mr. Pandaria was a massive joke and definitely lost faith in the game. I definitely think Mr. Pandaria had a much negative influence on the sub numbers than Cataclysm ever did. Plus, you've also got to think about how popular MOBA games were back in those days, and they're becoming more and more popular. And I think, honestly, the advancement of MOBA games is why Cataclysm didn't get more subscribers than Wrath of the Lich King. Like, the population of the game started to dwindle rather than increase, because the whole gaming industry and the climate of the gaming industry was changing. I was actually going to name this video In Defense of Cataclysm, because I do want to take the time to highlight some of the great elements of the expansion I think many people have forgotten. At a first glance, Cataclysm was extremely exciting. There was a lot of hype for the game. It was the first time I had ever actually gone to game and bought the game on a midnight release. The lore and the story from a face value was very enthralling. Okay, the idea of a world-ending giant mutant dragon trying to destroy the old world of Azeroth, the continent you kind of forgot about because you've been busy in Outland and Northrend for the past 4 years. There was hints of underwater zones, new class and race combinations like Human Hunter, the chance to actually become a werewolf. And everything was just overall very exciting. I think, this is why Cataclysm was able to maintain such a high population over from Wrath into Cataclysm for the launch and, the first few months that the game was released. And if you think about it, overall, I think Cataclysm was one of the best expansions for the sheer amount of content that was actually released in the game. There are many raids, dungeons, and beyond heroic difficulty dungeon content that many people have forgotten, like the Zul'Gurub and Zulaman remakes, and not to mention how they totally revamped the old leveling zones. If you think about it, because they totally revamped the old leveling zones, Cataclysm was basically a brand new MMO game. I know many people didn't like how the old vanilla zones were removed, because it obviously killed the nostalgia that people felt for those old leveling zones, but if we're going to be honest, they were drastically improved. There was more cinematics, voice acting, and it was a much more interesting and story-driven experience. For instance, the Forsaken starter zones actually had you on a mini-campaign alongside key characters like Sylvanas to battle the forces of Gilneas. You always felt like you were more in the thick of it alongside key characters, and the sense of story was much stronger than it was in vanilla, since, let's be honest, in vanilla you were just told to go and kill 10 balls and then come back, and you basically had to do that all the way level 1 to 60. The only problem was that at this point Dungeon Finder was already in the game, and every MMO player always picks the path of least resistance, i.e. pressing a button on your microbar, automatically grouping up with 4 other people to kill mobs over and over again in a dungeon until you are max level. So many of these revamped Cataclysm zones were totally unappreciated. Moving on, I definitely think the raid content was also very strong. This is when Blizzard actually really started to make the effort to make the raid mechanics more inventive, and I think it did start in Wrath of the Lich King, but it was definitely more fleshed out in Cataclysm. You know, for instance, being on the back of Deathwing's back for one raid fight, that was really cool. You also have the last boss of Blackwing Descent, where you had to tank both Onyxia and Nefarian at the same time, had to stand on these pillars, otherwise the whole room would fill up with molten lava. Raids like that were just really cool, and they actually released 3 raids at launch: Blackwing Descent, Bastion of Twilight, and Throne of the Four Winds. There was a ridiculous amount of content for people to chew through when Cataclysm came out, much more than you get with expansions these days. There are also many fun dungeons, especially the ZG and Zul Aman remakes that I mentioned earlier. This was essentially a mini patch between raid tiers, and they were very similar to what, you know, later became Mythic Dungeons, which obviously came in Warlords of Draenor. And to be honest, I think this is probably the most fun I actually had in the expansion, because, you know, sometimes dungeon content is just simply more fun than a raid content, and yeah, they were awesome because they were just so ridiculously challenging for me as a more younger and an inexperienced player anyway. I also liked how the progression worked in Cataclysm. It was very frustrating, obviously, to raid every week and not get gear, but the emblem system kind of countered this. That was obviously introduced in, you know, TBC, fleshed out in Wrath of the Lich King, and then I think it became much more streamlined in Cataclysm because there were just 2 forms of badges, Badges of Justice and Badges of Valor, which made things, yeah, just much simpler, and it's very easy for you to catch up on gear if you've taken a few weeks off, or to level up your alts. And overall, you just had to deal with much less frustrating RNG when it came to gearing up your character. Another great addition to Cataclysm was Rated Battlegrounds. Most people who play World of Warcraft are totally ignorant to how fun RBGs actually were. For me personally, it's the most fun I've ever actually had playing World of Warcraft, and it kept me so addicted to the game that when MoP came out, I essentially just played Rated Battlegrounds non-stop, from the start of the expansion to the end of the expansion, and I was playing the game most nights, and I didn't take a single break from the game. I normally take a break a little bit on every single expansion, but Mists of Pandaria was the only time I ever actually never took a break for a whole expansion. To put it in perspective, I didn't even touch PvE content during Mists of Pandaria, partly because I hated the Kung Fu Panda stuff, but also because RBGs were literally that fun. So overall, when I look back at Cataclysm, I don't really have a lot of hate towards the expansion, and I think the hate that the community feels is a little uncalled for, because the first half of the expansion was strong, but I will agree that the second half was ultimately, you know, kind of began the downfall of World of Warcraft. You can't even argue that was earlier, to be honest. I think the point is that there's been, over time, many different nails in the coffin, but the last patch of Cataclysm was a big one for many people. I think if Cataclysm had, you know, it did start strong, if it had carried on being strong, it would, you know, would have been up there as one of the best expansions, like Wrath of the Lich King and TBC. But the whole concept of a raid finder really did kill the heart of World of Warcraft. The heart of World of Warcraft is that, you know, it's an MMO where you cannot complete the end game objective without doing it with other people. So you have to socialise with other people. That's the whole point of a multiplayer game. Okay, and giving people the ability to see the end game content with very little effort was definitely a step in the wrong direction, in my opinion, for World of Warcraft. And I think as time has gone on, World of Warcraft has become less and less of an MMO, and it's why so many people went back to classic WoW. So overall, I don't think early Cataclysm was all that bad, and I think many people have forgotten that, just because the second half of Cataclysm was indeed pretty bad. There you go, video over. My name is MetaGoblin. To my next video, ciao.